Some things don't call out to men. They wait for a horse to listen first. The storage auction had already ended, and most of the crowd was drifting away under a pale Texas sky, their boots dragging dust across the cracked asphalt, as if nothing worth remembering had happened here. Ethan Cole stood alone beside Unit 47. A rusted metal door rolled halfway open, the faint smell of old wood and forgotten years seeping into the warm air. He hadn't meant to win it. Truth was, he hadn't meant to bid at all. But something about the silence that followed the auctioneer's call, the way no one else even bothered to look twice, had pulled his hand up before his mind could catch it. $200 for a pile of junk, someone had muttered behind him, not quiet enough to hide the edge of amusement. Ethan didn't answer. He had heard worse, and lately, words didn't carry much weight anyway. Not since the bank's final notice sat folded on his kitchen table. Not since the nights on his ranch grew longer and quieter than they should have been. Behind him, tied loosely to the side rail of his old pickup, Lumen shifted his weight, the Mustang's dark coat catching the fading light like a piece of moving shadow. The horse didn't snort or pull at the rope. He simply watched. His ears flicked once, then settled forward, locked onto the open unit as if something inside had already spoken to him. Ethan noticed it without meaning to. Lumen had that way about him. Quiet, but certain. The kind of stillness that made a man pause, even when he had no reason to. "It's nothing," Ethan muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the horse. He stepped closer and pulled the metal door the rest of the way up. It groaned like it had been holding its breath for years. Inside, the unit revealed exactly what everyone expected. Broken chairs stacked crooked against one wall. A cracked mirror leaning at an angle that caught only fragments of the sky. Cardboard boxes sagging under their own weight, their edges softened by time and dust. There was no shine, no hidden treasure waiting in plain sight. Just the quiet evidence of a life packed away and forgotten. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried more fatigue than disappointment. He walked inside, boots crunching softly over scattered debris, and nudged one of the boxes with the toe of his boot. It gave easily, collapsing inward with a dull sigh. Paper spilled out. Old receipts. Faded photographs. Nothing that could pay a debt or hold back the bank for even a day. Outside, Lumen let out a low breath. Not loud, not urgent, but different. Ethan turned his head slightly. The Mustang hadn't moved, but his body had changed. Muscles drawn just enough to suggest tension. Eyes fixed, unblinking, on the far corner of the unit where the light barely reached. Ethan followed that gaze. At first, he saw nothing. Just another pile of discarded wood and a dented metal trunk half buried beneath a collapsed shelf. He almost looked away. Almost. Then Lumen stepped forward, just one slow, deliberate step, the rope pulling gently against the rail. The sound was soft, but it echoed louder than it should have in the quiet space between them. Ethan felt it then. Not fear. Not excitement. Something quieter. The kind of feeling that doesn't ask for permission, only attention. He glanced back at the horse, then again at the shadowed corner. "You see something, don't you?" he murmured. Lumen didn't move again. He didn't need to. The silence around them shifted, as if the past stored inside that unit had just taken a breath of its own. And for the first time since the auction ended, Ethan wasn't thinking about the money he'd lost. He was wondering what exactly his horse had found. The air inside the storage unit felt heavier now, like it had settled around something that did not want to be disturbed. And Ethan Cole stood there longer than he intended, his eyes fixed on the same shadowed corner where Lumen refused to look away, the late afternoon sun slipping lower behind him and casting long lines of light that barely reached the back wall, leaving the dented metal trunk half hidden beneath a leaning board that looked ready to give way at the slightest touch. And for a moment Ethan did nothing, just listening to the quiet, because there was something in it, something different from the empty silence he had grown used to on his ranch. This silence had weight, like it was waiting for him to make a choice, and outside Lumen shifted again, a slow, deliberate movement, the rope creaking softly against the rail, not restless, not afraid, just certain. And that was what unsettled Ethan the most, because Lumen was not a horse that spooked easily, not one to react without reason, and yet here he was, holding his ground like there was something worth noticing in a place everyone else had already dismissed. Ethan ran a hand along the back of his neck and let out a quiet breath before stepping deeper into the unit. his boots crunching over brittle paper and splintered wood as he moved toward the corner, the smell of dust growing thicker with each step. And when he reached the pile, he crouched slowly, brushing aside a warped plank that shifted with a hollow sound, revealing more of the trunk beneath it, the metal surface scratched and dulled with age. The latch rusted but intact, and there was something about the way it sat there, not tossed like the rest of the junk, but almost placed, like someone had meant for it to be found, just not by everyone. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering for a second before resting against the cool metal, and as his fingers touched it he felt a faint vibration, not from the trunk itself, but from the ground beneath, or maybe from his own pulse. He could not tell. And outside Lumen exhaled again, a low steady breath that seemed to push him forward. Ethan tightened his grip and pulled the trunk free from the debris, the sound of metal scraping against concrete cutting through the quiet as he dragged it into the strip of light, dust rising around it in slow drifting clouds. He wiped his palm across the lid, clearing just enough grime to see a faint marking near the corner, something etched, not factory-made, more like a symbol or initials carved by hand, worn down but still there. And he frowned slightly, leaning closer, trying to make it out. But the fading light made it difficult, and for a moment he considered leaving it, loading everything as is and dealing with it back at the ranch. But Lumen let out a sharper breath this time, not loud, but enough to stop that thought in its tracks. Ethan glanced back over his shoulder, the horse standing perfectly still now, ears forward, eyes locked on him with that same quiet insistence, and Ethan gave a small nod, almost without thinking. Before turning back to the trunk, he reached for the latch, his fingers brushing away flakes of rust as he tested it, the metal resisting at first, then giving slightly with a dry click that sounded far too loud in the stillness. He paused again, not because he was afraid, but because something about the moment felt bigger than it should have. Like opening this was not just about finding something useful, it was about stepping into a story that had been waiting a long time to be told. And as the sun dipped lower, casting the last of its light across the floor and onto the worn surface of the trunk, Ethan slowly lifted the lid, just enough for the darkness inside to begin revealing its shape. The lid opened with a slow, reluctant creak, and for a moment Ethan Cole saw nothing but darkness inside the trunk, a hollow space that seemed to swallow the fading light rather than reflect it. And he leaned closer, one hand steady on the edge as his eyes adjusted, the scent rising from within, not sharp or rotten but dry, like paper left untouched for years. And then shapes began to form, outlines first, then detail. Not piles of cash or anything that would instantly change his luck, but something quieter, something that carried a different kind of weight. Bundles wrapped in cloth, tied carefully with faded string, stacked in a way that spoke of intention rather than neglect. And on top of them lay a single object, a leather-bound journal worn smooth at the corners, its surface marked with the same faint symbol he had seen etched into the metal outside. Ethan reached in slowly, his fingers brushing the journal as if it might break under the wrong touch, and when he lifted it, dust fell away in soft clouds that drifted through the narrow beam of sunlight. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the texture, the age, the quiet presence of something that had been kept safe for a reason. And outside Lumen shifted again, the sound of his hoof against the ground steady and deliberate, as if urging him to go on. Ethan glanced back once, meeting the horse's gaze, and there was no fear there, no confusion, just that same calm certainty that had brought him to this moment. He opened the journal, the spine cracking slightly as if it had not been touched in years, and the first page revealed neat handwriting, faded but still clear enough to read, a name written at the top, Daniel Whitaker, followed by a date from over 20 years ago. Ethan frowned slightly, the name unfamiliar, yet something about it lingered, like a memory just out of reach. He flipped through a few pages, the entries detailed, not casual notes but records, observations, thoughts written by someone who had something to protect, references to land, to routes, to measurements marked in acres and miles, coordinates scribbled in the margins, and sketches, small careful drawings of terrain, fences, and what looked like boundaries. And Ethan felt a slow tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from the realization that this was no ordinary storage unit filled with forgotten junk. This was a place where someone had hidden something important, something that had not been meant to disappear. and as he turned another page, a photograph slipped loose and fell into his lap, the image aged but intact, showing a man standing beside a horse. The two framed by open land and a sky that stretched wide behind them. The man's face calm, his hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. And for a moment Ethan just stared, because there was something familiar in the way that horse stood, the posture, the quiet strength, the same kind of presence he saw every day in Lumen. He looked up instinctively, back toward the entrance of the unit, where Lumen stood in the fading light, unmoving, watching, as if he already knew what Ethan was beginning to understand, that this was not just a random find, not just a forgotten man's belongings, but a thread, a connection reaching across time. And as the last of the sunlight dipped lower, leaving the storage unit in a deeper shade of quiet, Ethan closed the journal slowly, his mind no longer on the money he needed or the debt waiting for him at home, but on the question that had just taken root. Why had Lumen led him here, and what exactly had this man been trying to leave behind? The journal felt heavier now that it was closed, as if the weight of its words had settled into Ethan Cole's hands, and he sat there on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit, the fading light pressing against the open doorway while shadows slowly claimed the space around him. And for a long moment he did not move, only listened to the quiet breathing of Lumen outside, steady and grounded, like an anchor to something real, while everything inside this unit began to shift into something he did not yet understand. Ethan finally stood, brushing dust from his jeans as he stepped back toward the entrance, the journal still in his grip, and when he reached Lumen he paused, resting a hand against the horse's neck, the warmth there cutting through the cooling evening air. "You knew," he murmured, not expecting an answer, but the horse flicked an ear and lowered his head slightly, the gesture small but certain, and Ethan let out a slow breath before turning back toward the unit, because, whatever this was, it was not something to leave behind. He spent the next hour loading what he could into the bed of his truck, the broken furniture stacked without care, the boxes lifted one by one, though now he handled them differently, not searching for value, but for meaning. And when he reached the trunk again, he hesitated only a second before lifting it with both hands, setting it carefully among the rest, the metal scraping softly against the worn surface of the truck bed, the journal. He kept with him, sliding it onto the passenger seat like something that deserved to be seen, not buried. By the time he closed the tailgate, the sky had shifted fully into evening, a thin line of gold fading behind the distant hills, and the auction lot had emptied, leaving only the sound of wind moving through loose gravel and the faint hum of a highway miles away. Ethan untied Lumen and led him toward the trailer, the Mustang stepping forward without resistance, but before climbing in he stopped again, turning his head slightly back toward the storage unit, his gaze lingering on the open doorway now swallowed by shadow, as if something inside still watched him leave. And for a brief second the thought crossed his mind that this was not the end of whatever story had been hidden there, only the beginning. The drive back to the ranch stretched longer than usual, the road cutting through open land that felt wider in the dark, headlights carving a narrow path through the quiet. And inside the truck the journal rested against the seat, shifting slightly with each turn as if reminding him of its presence. Ethan drove in silence, his mind replaying the name written on the first page, Daniel Whitaker, turning it over again and again like a puzzle piece that did not yet fit. And somewhere behind him Lumen moved softly in the trailer, calm, steady, as if this road was one he had already chosen long before Ethan raised his hand at the auction. When the ranch finally came into view, it looked the same as it always had, worn fences leaning under their own age, the barn standing crooked against the wind, a porch light flickering weakly near the front door. But something felt different as he pulled in, not in the land, but in the way he saw it, like the edges of his life had shifted just enough to let something new in. He parked the truck and stepped out, the night air cooler now, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain that might never come. He opened the trailer, and Lumen stepped down slowly, his hooves landing soft against the dirt, and instead of heading toward the barn, the horse paused, turning his head toward the house, then back toward Ethan, as if waiting, and Ethan understood without knowing why. He reached into the truck, picked up the journal, and held it for a moment under the dim porch light, the worn leather catching just enough glow to reveal that same faint symbol pressed into its surface. And as he looked at it, standing there between the quiet of his land and the unknown of what he had just brought home, Ethan felt something stir beneath the weight of his worry. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something close enough to make him take the first step toward the door with the sense that whatever had been hidden all those years was not finished speaking, and somehow it had chosen him to listen. The porch light buzzed faintly above Ethan Cole as he stepped inside, the screen door closing behind him with a soft creak that echoed through the quiet house. And for a moment he just stood there, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior where everything felt exactly as he had left it, and yet not quite the same. Like the walls themselves had shifted to make room for something new. The journal rested heavy in his hand, and he moved toward the old wooden table near the window, setting it down carefully as if it might speak if handled the right way. Outside he could hear Lumen moving slowly across the yard, the steady rhythm of hooves against dry earth carrying through the thin walls, grounding him, reminding him that whatever this was, he was not alone in it. Ethan pulled out the chair and sat, the wood creaking under his weight, and for a long second he did not open the journal. He just looked at it, the worn leather, the faint symbol pressed into its surface, the same mark he had seen on the trunk, now clearer under the yellow glow of the light, a shape that felt deliberate, almost like a brand but not quite, something personal, something meant to be recognized by only a few. He ran his fingers over it slowly, tracing the lines, and then finally he opened the journal again, turning past the first page to where the entries began to deepen, the handwriting steady but more urgent as the pages went on. Lines filled with notes that were no longer just observations but instructions, references to sections of land marked in acres, mentions of boundary lines that did not match any official maps Ethan had ever seen, and then names, not many, but enough to suggest this was never meant to be a solitary record. He leaned closer, reading each word carefully, and the further he went, the more a pattern began to emerge. Daniel Whitaker had not just been writing about land. He had been documenting something hidden within it, something that required precise directions, exact measurements, and an understanding of the terrain that only someone who had walked it for years would possess. Ethan's brow furrowed as he turned another page, where a rough sketch caught his attention, a drawing of what looked like a stretch of open ranch land, marked with a circle near a bend in a dry creek, a place labeled only with a short note, where the ground remembers, and Ethan felt a faint chill settle in his chest, not fear, but recognition of something deeper, something tied to the land itself. He sat back slightly, the chair shifting under him as the house remained silent around him, and outside Lumen let out a low breath, the sound drifting in through the open window, as if the horse sensed the shift in understanding happening inside. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, picturing his own land, the dry creek that ran along the far edge of his property, the one that had not seen water in years but still cut a clear line through the earth, and slowly, without forcing it, the pieces began to align. The sketch, the notes, the measurements, they were not random. They were describing something real, something that might not be as far away as he had first thought. His eyes opened again, sharper now, more focused, and he flipped back through the pages, searching for anything that might confirm it. And there it was, a set of coordinates scribbled in the margin, numbers that matched too closely to ignore. His land, or something very near it. Ethan leaned forward, his pulse steady but stronger now, and for the first time since the auction, the weight of his situation shifted into something else, something that felt like possibility, not the loud kind that promises easy answers, but the quiet kind that asks for patience and trust. He closed the journal slowly, resting his hand on its cover as the night deepened outside, and in the stillness of that small house, with the sound of Lumen standing somewhere beyond the door, Ethan understood one thing with a clarity that did not need explanation. Whatever Daniel Whitaker had hidden, it was not lost. It had been waiting, and somehow, through a forgotten storage unit and a horse that refused to walk away, it had found its way back to the one place it was meant to be uncovered. The night settled deeper around the ranch, pressing gently against the windows as Ethan Cole stepped back outside with the journal still in his hand, the air cooler now, carrying that faint, dry scent of land that had not seen rain in too long. And Lumen stood near the fence line, his silhouette steady beneath the dim glow of the porch light, waiting without impatience. As if time itself had slowed to match whatever path they were now walking, Ethan moved toward him, boots quiet against the packed dirt, and when he reached the Mustang, he rested his hand along the horse's neck again, feeling the warmth beneath the coat, the steady life there that had led him to this point without a single word. "You felt it before I did," he said softly, not as a question, but as an understanding, and Lumen lowered his head slightly, exhaling a slow breath that stirred the dust at their feet, and Ethan looked past him, out toward the far stretch of his land where the dark outline of the dry creek cut through the fields like an old scar that refused to fade. He had walked that ground 100 times, fixed fences along its edge, checked the soil when the seasons turned, and never once had he thought of it as anything more than a boundary, a line that marked where one part of his life ended and another began. But now the image from the journal sat clearly in his mind, the curve of the creek, the circle drawn with careful intent, the words written beside it, "Where the ground remembers." And something about that phrase stayed with him, not loud, not demanding, but steady, like a truth that did not need to explain itself. Ethan stepped back and reached for the halter, guiding Lumen slowly across the yard, not toward the barn, but toward the open stretch beyond, the night sky stretching wide above them, scattered with stars that seemed sharper in the absence of any other light. The path was familiar, every step one he had taken before. Yet tonight it felt different, as if the land itself was watching, waiting to see if he would finally understand what had been there all along. The wind moved gently through the dry grass, whispering against his boots as he walked, and Lumen followed without hesitation, his hooves steady, his presence calm but focused, as if he knew exactly where they were going. Even when Ethan did not fully trust his own direction, when they reached the edge of the creek bed, Ethan stopped, looking down at the cracked earth that stretched out before him, the ground uneven, marked by time and weather, and for a moment doubt crept in, quiet but real, because this place had always been empty, always been just another piece of land that offered nothing in return, and yet the journal said otherwise, the markings said otherwise, and Lumen shifted beside him, stepping forward just enough to break that hesitation, lowering his head toward a specific spot along the curve, his ears forward, his body still, and Ethan felt it again, that same quiet pull that had started back at the storage unit, not forcing him, not pushing, but guiding, and he stepped closer, kneeling slowly as his hand pressed against the dry soil, the surface rough beneath his palm, but there was something beneath it, something different, not visible, not obvious, but present, like the ground itself held a memory waiting to be uncovered. Ethan sat back on his heels, the journal resting beside him now, its pages filled with answers he had not yet fully read, and as he looked out across the land that had once felt like a burden too heavy to carry, he realized that this was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding, about uncovering something that had been hidden not because it was lost, but because it had been waiting for the right moment, the right hands, and perhaps even the right horse to bring it back into the light. And as Lumen stood beside him under the vast open sky, unmoving, certain, Ethan knew that whatever lay beneath this ground was only the beginning of a story that had chosen to continue through him. The ground did not give at first, and Ethan Cole pressed his palm harder against the dry surface as if expecting it to respond, but it remained still, cracked and silent beneath the weight of years. And for a moment, he almost let the doubt return, that quiet voice that told him this was nothing more than worn land and tired hope. But Lumen did not move away. The Mustang stood exactly where he had stopped, his head lowered toward that same point, his presence steady, and that steadiness held Ethan there longer than reason alone would have. He shifted forward, brushing loose dirt aside with his hands, the soil dry and brittle at the top, breaking easily under his fingers. But just a few inches down it changed, darker, packed tighter, as if something beneath had kept it from settling like the rest. And Ethan paused, his breath slowing as he felt that difference, small but undeniable. He reached back instinctively for the journal, flipping through the pages until he found the sketch again, the curve of the creek, the marked circle, and beneath it a short line he had nearly overlooked before. Not deep, just hidden from those who do not listen. He read it twice, the words settling into him differently now, and he looked back down at the ground with a sharper focus. This was not about digging blindly. It was about paying attention. He moved slightly to the left, then back again, testing the soil with his hand, feeling for that same firmness. And there it was again, a narrow strip where the earth felt less like loose dirt and more like something covering a shape. Ethan leaned forward and began clearing the area more carefully, using both hands now, pushing aside the dry top layer until his fingers brushed against something solid. Not rock, not wood exactly, but smoother, more deliberate. He stopped for a second, letting his hand rest there, feeling the edge of it beneath the soil, and Lumen let out a low breath behind him, the sound steady. Confirming what Ethan already knew, he dug a little more, exposing the surface inch by inch until a flat wooden panel revealed itself, weathered but intact. Its edges fitted too cleanly to be natural, and at one corner, just visible beneath the remaining dirt, was that same symbol again, carved shallow but unmistakable, the same mark from the trunk and the journal, tying this place to everything that had led him here. Ethan sat back slightly, his chest rising with a slow breath as the reality of it settled in. This was real, not coincidence, not imagination, but something placed here with purpose, something meant to be found only by someone willing to see beyond what the land showed on the surface. He brushed the remaining dirt away, uncovering more of the panel until it formed a rough rectangle about 3 feet across, set into the ground like a lid. And for a moment he did nothing, just looked at it, because opening it would mean stepping fully into whatever Daniel Whitaker had left behind. And that meant leaving behind the comfort of not knowing, the safety of believing his life was only as small as it had always been. Ethan glanced back at Lumen, the horse standing in the dim light, quiet, patient, as if he had already accepted whatever came next, and Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to the animal, before reaching down and finding the edge of the panel, his fingers slipping into a narrow gap where the wood met the soil. He pulled gently at first, feeling resistance, then a slow shift as the panel loosened with a soft, heavy sound, and as it lifted just enough for the darkness beneath to begin showing through, Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle over him again, the kind that did not need explanation, only trust. And in the stillness of the night, with the land stretching silent around him and Lumen standing close at his side, he understood that whatever waited below was not just hidden, it had been waiting for him to be ready to uncover it. The panel lifted slowly under Ethan Cole's grip, the wood resisting at first before giving way with a low, aged groan that seemed to echo deeper than the shallow space beneath it. And as he raised it just enough to peer inside, the darkness below did not feel empty. It felt contained, like something deliberately sealed away from the world above. He set the panel carefully to the side and leaned forward, bracing one hand against the edge as his eyes adjusted once more, and this time the shapes revealed themselves more clearly, not scattered, not forgotten, but arranged, a narrow compartment carved into the earth, lined with old boards that had held their place against time, and within it lay a series of smaller boxes, each one wrapped in cloth similar to what he had found in the trunk. Preserved, protected, as if whoever placed them here had trusted the land to guard them better than any lock ever could. Ethan reached down slowly, his fingers brushing against the topmost bundle, the fabric worn but intact, and when he lifted it, he felt its weight, not heavy enough to strain him, but solid, meaningful, and he brought it up into the faint light, setting it on the ground beside him. Lumen stepped closer now, just one quiet step, lowering his head as if to observe, his breath warm against Ethan's shoulder, steady, grounding. Ethan unwrapped the cloth carefully, layer by layer, revealing a small wooden box beneath, its surface smoother than the panel, its edges carved with the same symbol he had seen repeated again and again, and for a moment he just held it there, turning it slightly in his hands, the quiet of the night stretching around them, and then he opened it, the lid lifting without resistance, and inside there were no coins, no glittering objects that would catch the eye, but something else entirely, stacks of folded documents, yellowed with age but neatly kept, tied together with a thin strip of leather. Ethan lifted them out slowly, unfolding the top page, and as his eyes moved across the lines, the meaning did not come all at once, but in pieces, phrases that began to connect, references to ownership, to boundaries, to rights that had never been claimed in the way they should have been. His breath slowed as he read further, the realization, forming not in excitement but in quiet certainty. This was land, not just any land, but land tied directly to the markings he had seen in the journal, acres that extended beyond what he had known, recorded in a way that suggested they had been set aside, protected, never transferred through the channels that would have made them visible to the world. Ethan sat back slightly, the papers still in his hands, and looked out across the dark stretch of his ranch, the familiar outline now holding a different weight, a different possibility. But before that thought could settle fully, a sound carried across the night, distant but clear enough to break the stillness, the low rumble of an engine somewhere beyond the far road, and Ethan's head lifted instinctively, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened, because no one came out this way at this hour without reason, and Lumen reacted as well, his ears turning sharply toward the sound, his body shifting just enough to show awareness, not fear, but alertness, and Ethan felt it then, the shift in the moment, the realization that whatever had been hidden here had not remained untouched by the world entirely. That time had passed, but perhaps not enough to erase all ties to it. He gathered the documents carefully, placing them back into the box for the moment, his movements deliberate, controlled, and as the distant sound faded slightly, carried off by the wind, he glanced once more at the open compartment beneath the ground, knowing there was more there, more pieces of a story that had not yet been fully revealed, but also understanding that this discovery was no longer just his alone to consider. Something had begun to move beyond the quiet of his land, something that might reach for what had been left behind. And as he stood slowly, the box held firmly in his hands, Ethan knew that the path ahead was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about deciding what to do with it before the world came looking for it on its own. The night air held still around Ethan Cole as he stood at the edge of the open ground, the wooden box pressed firmly in his hands. The distant sound of the engine now faded into silence as if it had never been there at all, and yet the feeling it left behind remained. Not fear, not urgency, but awareness, the kind that settles deep and does not leave easily. Lumen stood beside him, unmoving, his presence steady as ever, and Ethan exhaled slowly before kneeling once more beside the open compartment, his movements calmer now, more certain. He reached down and carefully returned the remaining bundles to their place, covering them just enough to protect what was still hidden, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for something that had endured longer than he had understood. Then he lifted the wooden panel and set it back into place, pressing it down until it fit as naturally into the ground as it had before, the symbol disappearing beneath the thin layer of dirt as if the land itself accepted it once again. When he stood, the box still in his hands, he did not look around in worry or rush. Instead, he turned slowly toward the house, the path back familiar, yet changed in the way it felt beneath his feet, like each step carried a weight that was no longer just his own. Lumen followed without hesitation, his hooves soft against the earth, the two of them moving together through the quiet night as if nothing needed to be said between them. By the time they reached the porch, the sky had deepened fully into darkness, stars stretching wide overhead, and Ethan paused for a moment before stepping inside, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that everything had shifted. Inside the house, the same dim light waited, casting long shadows across the table where the journal still rested, and Ethan set the box beside it, the two objects now part of the same story, one discovered, the other still unfolding. He opened the box again, slower this time, and took out the documents, spreading them carefully across the worn wood, his eyes moving across the pages with a steadiness that had not been there before, the words no longer just fragments, but clear, connected, forming a truth that did not demand to be rushed. The land described in those papers, the boundaries, the rights, they were real, but what mattered more was how they had been protected, how they had been left in a way that trusted someone would come along who would understand their value beyond money. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the weight of his old worries still there, the debt, the uncertainty, but no longer pressing in the same way, because now there was something else beside it, something quieter, something steadier, a sense that what he had been given was not just a chance to change his circumstances, but a responsibility to honor something that had been. Carried across time, he glanced toward the window where Lumen stood just outside, visible in the faint light, calm, watchful, as if he had always known where this path would lead, and Ethan gave a small nod, not in gratitude alone, but in understanding, because the horse had not brought him here for wealth or for escape, but for something that ran deeper than either, something rooted in the land, in memory, in truth. And as the night settled around the ranch once more, quiet and wide and endless, Ethan gathered the papers carefully, placing them back into the box, not with urgency, but with intention, and he knew that whatever came next, whether the world came looking or not, whether the path ahead was easy or not, he would not walk it the same way he had before, because sometimes the things buried beneath the surface are not meant to be taken. They are meant to be understood, and sometimes it takes a horse, steady and silent, to remind a man where to begin.